Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Finlo Costain. Phepson Angus, run by Rob Havard, produces pedigree grass-fed organic Aberdeen Angus breeding cattle. Rob says that their key measure is profit per acre, not production per acre. I asked him what that means.
I think in our business, we're always looking for trying to make sure that we're making profit from what nature provides. And so if we're just looking at production per acre, and that's something that was quite prevalent in the industry when we were subsidy based, and particularly where the subsidies were production based. And we've got a bit of a hangover from that in the industry now. So it was production at all costs, and obviously that came out of the war effort, and we needed to produce food, so we were paid for producing more, almost regardless of the additional cost of production of those extra units of production. So profit per acre is really looking at how much more money you're making from the extra production per acre, rather than looking at how much you're producing. There's a lot of people still talk about the importance and the duty to produce food for the nation. But I think that's gone. That duty isn't there if government policy is to just import cheap food that's produced to a lower standard, to those regulations. So I think what's key for us really is actually producing in an environmental way and making sure that, we can cash flow profitability each and every year and not risking that as well. And I think the other side of it is, I don't think you could just characterize as the system as profit per acre versus production per acre. We also think about risk, because the high input models, and if we're in the cattle industry, the high input models, you put the bull in, 9 months later you get a calf, and then 2 years after that, or maybe a bit before, you get to sell it, but you kind of, or at least 2 years before you get paid. So a lot of costs out the door before you then get paid for your product. And obviously lots of things can change at that time, so the cost of production can go up during the cost phase, and then the price you receive can go down at the commodity level just before you sell. So it's about trying to take control of that as well, and so have predictable profit that's consistent, rather than sort of everything based on a subsidy system, or the risk of potential high input systems costing you the business.
Rob, when farmers are looking for regenerative beef breeding stock, what are the key traits that they need from their cattle?
I think if you look just from a simplistic view, the key thing is fertility. Mm-hmm. So if you look at, for example, suckler cow systems in the UK, whether they're regenerative or not, actually, fertility is the number one profit predictor. If you can produce a marketable calf every year from a cow, you kind of then know what you're going to be receiving in income, and you can work your costs off that basis. When you start having problems with fertility, and say for 100 cows, if you only get 75 calves, the difference between that and getting 95 or more towards 100 calves, you cannot make that up in growth rate and production. And so actually the fertility and the fecundity of your females is probably the number one thing people need to focus on.
So fertility is paramount, but what other traits are important for regen systems?
Well, a key thing is being adapted to the system and the environment that they operate in. And so we sort of operate on a basis that the cows it almost needs to be a walk in the park for what they're doing. So, just producing a calf every year, raising it, we keep the calves on until they're 10 months. Whilst they're carrying a calf inside them, they get 60 days off, and then they're calving again. So they're working all year really, but that needs to be quite easy for them to maintain body condition, meet the metabolic requirements, and just get the job done. As soon as you put too much stress on them, requiring too much growth, too much performance, then you're potentially going to lose out on fertility, or that you risk other traits as well. So I think having things that work. And then the other side of it is making sure that they're problem free. So if we're essentially looking at low cost systems, so the more times you handle the cattle, the more times you treat them, the cost of medicine, cost of, say, trimming hooves. So things like structure is really important in cows. So people often talk about foot problems, but foot problems are usually actually structure problems. So if you get the structure of the animal right, then you're not going to be trimming hooves. You're not going to have that problem. You're also not going to have less likely to have lameness. They're going to be more robust, and the animals actually use less energy moving around if their locomotion is good and the biomechanics is good. So stuff like that's actually, you can get into lots of detail on it, but essentially it comes down to a problem-free cow. So, for example, good udder structure, really important, so that you're never having to assist a calf to latch on. You're never having to strip an udder because of mastitis, and that's usually down to udder structure. So just everything trying to, minimize the amount of times we have to get them in and treat them or do something with them. And we focus on a lot of that. Even head structure and eye structure is something. You look at proper head and eye structure, something people don't talk about very often, but actually, there's something called New Forest eye, which can affect them. But often what happens is the eye drains from the front of the eye, and in a proper head structure that you see in wild animals and you see in well-bred cattle as well, is that when that eye drains, the drop that comes from it drops straight to the ground when the animal's head is looking straight forward. But you see a lot of facial structure where it just sort of drips onto the face, and then you get a sort of a pool of that fluid in front, which attracts flies and then causes infection. So just attention to little bits of detail like that is stuff that, when we've been selecting for as long as we have, we're almost run out of things to select for. So it allows us to focus more keenly on just making sure that what we sell to our customers doesn't give them any problems, because that's not good for our reputation.
That's fascinating. Now, when one of the key aspects of regenerative agriculture is diversity, what role do pedigree breeds play in this?
Diversity is really important in many ways in terms of the variety of species that operate on a landscape and within an ecosystem. And so you're not just looking at diversity within the different kinds of cattle that you need to look at. We actually line breed our cattle, so they're not that genetically diverse, because we're actually trying to fix the positive traits there that want them. But if you look at wild populations, for example, wild populations of red deer, actually our breeding strategies are really similar to how wild herbivores operate, which, quite often you might have, for example, a red deer stag might stand a harem of hinds for 5, 6, 7 years, which means he's breeding onto his daughters. And those harems tend to be family groups of mother, daughter, granddaughter. And so he'll keep breeding. And as he starts breeding on his daughters, there's going to be some inbreeding depression, so less genetic diversity. But then what happens is the males from that line will tend to then have inbreeding depression, won't be as big and strong. They won't have that heterogeneity, that hybrid vigor that makes them bigger and stronger. So it's more likely then that another male from somewhere else that is bigger and stronger is going to win the battle of the stags to win the harem next time. And so that brings in the genetic diversity. So when you actually look at how those wild herds operate, which is actually to kind of line breed until it's kind of reducing vigor, and then that naturally then brings in other genetics. And we find actually not that we necessarily model on that, but just as we mimic our grazing to mimic naturalistic grazing systems, our breeding systems also mimic natural systems too.
How did you identify this particular gap in the breeding market?
When I was quite lucky that I came across a lot of the regenerative stuff pretty early on. So I was a professional ecologist from 2003, as well as having a family farm. So I'd actually grazed a lot of nature reserves, and we were grazing for nature. One of the things I realized was that the cattle actually weren't making any money because I was getting paid to graze nature reserves, but the actual cattle themselves weren't profitable. And I always had a concern that one day the environmental subsidies and the environmental payments might disappear. So we needed these businesses to stand on their own 2 feet. So that had always been in the back of my mind. And then when I started with holistic management in 2012, I was quite early, and I had some recognition early, and some consultancy came from that. And some of the bigger states and some of the bigger operations that were attempting to transition to regenerative systems with cattle that were high production cattle. And to be honest, I saw some absolute train wrecks, and I realized that with a lot of neighbors looking over the fence and people looking at this new kind of farming, which I'd found was potentially the answer to productive, resilient family farms farming in an ecological way, there was a big risk to the movement if it didn't work because the cattle genetics were wrong. So I came away from those experiences, and realized there's a huge hole there. We need to consider in order to fill that hole, we need to consider the whole picture. And that's what holistic management's about. And so for me, there was something that needed solving, but it was also an opportunity to fill that gap. And as more and more people come into regenerative systems, there's a greater and greater demand for regenerative genetics. And we need to do the job. That's the other realization, is we need to do the job of nature in selection, because there aren't the big predators here. So we need to just follow that natural process. And essentially, if everyone does that, you don't need people like me. You can kind of do this yourself. I mean, it might take you a long time, but we can maybe help speed that process up. But essentially, you have to follow that process of selecting out as nature would. Otherwise, you're going to end up with problems.
And just finally, and following on from what you were saying there, many regenerative farmers build up their herd genetics to suit their particular situation. Do you find farmers coming back to you time and again, or is your role primarily to start them off on that regenerative journey?
I think there's a difference, there's a combination of customers that we have. But if I think about really the regenerative sector, one of the key things is often reducing cow frame size. So they'll buy our bulls that are slightly smaller to make smaller cows, so that their cow costs are lowered within those systems. And we've got some big farms supplying some, 600 suckler cows. Cows are too big, costing too much. And so that allows them to do that. But the great thing is that actually, although I often encourage people to breed their own bulls from the bulls they buy from us, if they want to, and they can maybe move things forward that way too, often they still want to come back. And the repeat custom is probably one of the most pleasing things for us, because we get to know the customers, we get to know their herds, we hear about how their performance is going, and if we need to tweak anything on breeding or have any feedback from them, that's great. So yeah, the repeat custom is the best thing about the business, to be honest, and I love those interactions with customers.
That was Rob Havard from Phepson Angus. More news on our website, 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.